Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and this is going to be a brief little review/discussion video on The Amazing Spider-Man, the 2012 Mark Webb-directed film, and starring primarily Andrew Garfield, Emma Stone, Reese Ifans, Dennis Leary, Martin Sheen, Sally Field, and so forth. I really enjoyed this movie. You know, I'm somebody who really enjoyed the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, but as I posted on Facebook the other night, basically when I watched that Raimi trilogy, I really enjoyed watching Spider-Man. I got a kick out of it. It was a great experience watching, Raimi's take on Spider-Man, whereas watching this film, it made me want to be Spider-Man for the first time since I was a kid, just as much as I grew up wanting to be Batman or Superman, that kind of thing. This was definitely much more up my alley. It was kind of, going into it, I remember them saying it was going to be a darker, more sort of realistic version of Spider-Man, the, Dark Knight sort of take on Spider-Man, if you will. And I think there are aspects of it in the end that do kind of cut close to the mark, but at the same time, it's still very much a, fantastical story, lots of adventure. And even though we have a Peter Parker who's a little more brooding, a little more sort of closed off from his peers and stuff like that, I think it's done in a much more realistic way. Overall, for the entire film, it just seemed like it was caked in a realism that definitely spoke to me, reminded me of my own time in school and stuff like that. And the performances in this film, I mean, going down the cast again, Andrew Garfield, here's a guy that I was familiar with from Doctor Who. He was in the Daleks Take Manhattan, I think it was a two-parter. But he played an American in 1930s New York during, the Great Depression. And I thought it was just really interesting that here's this British actor, and I wouldn't have known it. I mean, you don't hear a hint of an accent in his Peter Parker, and his Peter Parker comes across as being just an average kid. He's not emo, he's not on the extreme, he's not an outcast fully, to the point where he doesn't have friends and that kind of thing, but he is very sort of self-guarded and stuff like that. And you see that he does have somewhat of a tumultuous relationship, being bullied and stuff, but we see him rebound from that in this movie, and it's done in a more realistic way than I felt the Raimi films were. And I don't mean to keep comparing this to those films, but that's largely what everybody's going to be doing anyway, so why stop now? Essentially, I thought the love interest in this film, too, as portrayed by Emma Stone, Gwen Stacy, going back to basics, the original love interest of Peter Parker, absolutely a masterstroke as far as I was concerned. And I love that they don't start off liking each other necessarily, and it didn't feel in any sort of way to me artificial. And I have to say that with the relationship between Peter Parker and MJ, Mary Jane, in the Raimi films, I did feel like, this is cinema. This is a film version of a relationship. I didn't really buy it. Here, I find myself buying it. And that's the thing I have to say about this film. It pulls no punches, one iota. And what I mean by that, and I'm just going to give everybody a warning now, I should have started off with this, but this is going to be spoilery. If you haven't seen The Amazing Spider-Man, I'm going to be talking about aspects that are pretty huge to do with the plot, and I'm frankly surprised that I went into this not having been already spoiled. I mean, there hasn't been a lot of coverage on this film that I've seen, that I've come across, that could have spoiled me. In fact, the things that I have seen pointed me in the other direction. Now, being that I gave the spoiler warning, I'm just going to go ahead full on. The death of Uncle Ben in this film was completely unexpected, because I read an article that said, he didn't die, that he would be carried on into the next film. And so I didn't expect it at all when it happened. Another point being very similar to that was when Captain Stacy dies. Again, a character that I was led to believe would make it into the sequel. And in fact, by the end of the film, if you watch it all the way to the end, of course, you see that he goes out in a very sort of noble way, coming to the aid of, Peter Parker / Spider-Man fighting off the Lizard. And I was completely astounded by this. But the reason I say, if I take a step back, that this film doesn't pull punches, not to do with these deaths. I mean, with the death of Uncle Ben, with the death of Captain Stacy, these are things that are integral to the story. These are things that have happened in the comics. Where this film doesn't pull punches for me are things like Peter Parker revealing his secret to Gwen, Peter Parker unmasking himself and letting Captain Stacy see him when Gwen is in danger. These kind of things that could have been played in a sort of Batman film, anthology way, where every single film the love interest has to stumble onto the fact that Bruce Wayne is Batman somehow, some way, and inevitably they go their separate ways, that kind of thing. And this movie was very much about just being brass tacks, being real with the situation. Hey, I got bit by a weird spider. I'm going to look for my parents. I'm trying to find out my history. I don't fit in at school. I meet this girl. She kind of digs me. I want her to know the biggest thing that has just happened to me. She's in danger. I'm going to tell her father so I can save her. It just, to me, it was much more fluent and much more realistic. If I were Peter Parker in that circumstance, I would probably make those choices, whereas I'm watching Smallville for 11 years, and every other episode of Smallville, Clark Kent is doing something that makes me want to punch my TV, making stupid decisions. We had a Peter Parker that was doing it realistically, doing it the way I would have done it, and I think most audiences would. And again, going back to the performances, the performance between the two, the chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone, when I saw what they were doing in this film, I just ran with it. I absolutely loved it. I connected with it. And, I kind of felt while I was watching this film as though, I know that Raimi said about his trilogy, he was kind of paying homage to aspects of Spider-Man that he felt when he grew up and that kind of thing. And from what I've read, when Gwen Stacy died in the comics, there were fans who were really heartbroken over that because this was the love of Peter's life. So they saw it as this big, heartbreaking, huge thing. And I don't know if that's true for all fans, but I felt like watching this movie, I can kind of understand why they would be moved so much, that kind of thing. I just really bought into that relationship between them. It felt very real to me. Now, when we talk about the relationship between Peter and his aunt and uncle, of course, there's that mystery about the parents. And one thing I will say about that is going into the film, I was under the impression this was going to take up a large chunk of the storytelling, but I was actually really pleasantly surprised to see that, that is sort of the overhanging arc of this film series, however many films they're going to eventually make with this version of Spider-Man, I don't know, but I am happy that they have put those little grains of salt in what's going on with Peter's parents, where did they run off to, who chased them away, what's up with that shadowy guy who visited Kurt Connors in his cell, that kind of stuff. I am wondering about all of that, but I'm glad that wasn't a major focus in this film. It was kind of in the background. And a lot of what was the focus in the film was the relationship between Peter, his aunt and uncle, and the basic bad guy, the villain of the piece, Dr. Kurt Connors, a.k.a. the Lizard. Now, when it comes to Martin Sheen and Sally Field, when I first heard that they were cast in this film, I really didn't know if I was going to get into them as much as I had the actor and actress who played Uncle Ben and Aunt May in the Raimi trilogy. And let me just say, the first couple scenes into this movie with them, I loved them. I loved the casting. I thought Martin Sheen was just pitch perfect as Ben. It was criminal that we got to see so little of him as far as I was concerned by the end of this, because I felt like he could have done so much more. But I did like that, a message he leaves Peter on his cell phone is something that they pick up with toward the end, thus making the whole arc of this story kind of one big circle. And with Sally Field's Aunt May, again, it kind of came full circle because she really showed herself to be aware of the whole situation. I really believe by the end of this, this is not, we're tiptoeing around it. It's all cutesy Sam Raimi film version of Aunt May, who may or may not know that Peter's Spider-Man, I'm just going to give you advice and, hope for the best. Maybe he is, wink, wink, nudge, nudge to the audience. We have an Aunt May who definitely has a set of brains under that mop of hair, and she knows, she's watching the news, she's watching what's going on between Spider-Man and the Lizard, seeing Peter come home black-eyed, beaten up, bruised all over the place. She knows what the hell is going on. I am almost certain of it, as certain as I am that, Gwen Stacy knows by the end. I know Aunt May knows, and that just I don't know, it imbues me with confidence because we're not playing this sort of guessing game anymore. And there's an aspect to that. For me, I always felt like it worked more with Superman and Clark Kent, even though, as ridiculous as it is, the set of glasses, oh, nobody knows he's Superman. But I feel like the in and outs with the people at the Daily Planet and Lois Lane, that makes more sense to me. That sort of Americana version of the superhero story, whereas here, yes, there is some aspect of that I do want to see continue. I do want characters to not know who Spider-Man is. I don't know if I want him unmasking himself on the news like he did in the comics so that the whole world knows, which I think might have been retconned. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But essentially, I like the idea that the people closest to him, it may remain unspoken, but for all intents and purposes, I think they're all onto it. And so, yeah, I'm definitely digging that aspect of it. Now, if we look at the villain, the Lizard, I thought this was a perfect villain for this movie because it's not somebody we've seen before, and the CG for me was just ultra realistic. Not once did I question it. You know, there were times when I was watching like Ang Lee's Hulk where that CG Hulk just didn't really work for me. There were times even with the Edward Norton Hulk movie, the CG didn't work for me. Largely it worked better in that movie, I thought, than the Ang Lee Hulk, and even more so in the Avengers. Let me not forget Avengers, where I believed it the most. You know, even though there were some big, heavily CG oriented sequences that were kind of iffy, I still loved Avengers. But here we had a creature that made it believable as far as I was concerned. I didn't have any trouble swallowing this big lizard villain. And the motivations, you know, did kind of get a little sketchy for me, I will admit. They were kind of getting into Norman Osborn Green Goblin territory with him talking to himself and stuff. And I'll admit I'm not that big of a follower of the Lizard in the comics, so I don't know how true to the mark that is. But the actor Reese Ifans, I really felt like he was a perfect casted role as well. Because you have this guy who is, you know, he's very passionate about his science. He's very passionate about the goals he wanted to reach with Peter's father. And there's this great moment when Peter's gone to his house and introduced himself as the son of Richard Parker. And, you know, they're in there, they're drinking coffee, whatever it is, and there's a point where Connors, you know, he says, I'm sorry about your father. You know, he's telling him the backstory, and he says, I was really angry. And the delivery of this, I was never more confident that this was real. In most performances I've seen, I mean, that's the thing about this movie. It really stuck out to me that, again, to use that term, the realism was really there for every one of the actors. I mean, even Dennis Leary's cop character, I've seen cop characters that don't come off as genuine, and I mean, one of my grandfathers was a police officer in New York. So I know this kind of guy. I know this kind of guy because I've seen it. And to me, it just rang very genuine. That's a lot of what was going on in this movie. It rang very genuine. And I think that is largely why I enjoyed it, because while it did ring genuine, as I keep saying, it still was fantastical. It still was superheroes in tights, flying around on webs, kicking bad guy ass, you know, and it was done in just a very respectful way. Now, one of the things, again, going back to my phrase, you know, that it didn't pull punches, that really just impressed me was the whole Flash Thompson thing, because it started out very much the same way it did in the Sam Raimi trilogy, but then they never picked up on it again. You know, we had Harry being the bad guy, Harry Osborn, and so that, you know, that was the relationship, the friendship relationship with Peter in that trilogy. Here, though, even though I know that in a sequel we're potentially going to get Harry Osborn at some point, and quick little side, if I may, I did like how they referenced Norman Osborn, but you never saw him, so they can cast him at some point later on down the line. He wasn't integral into this, and they don't want to be backed into a corner with an actor who they may not have back as the character. But in any case, I liked that this Flash Thompson thing, while it began very much like it did in the Raimi films, as I say, it took a complete 180-degree turn by the end of the movie that totally surprised me. I did not see coming that point where Flash stops Peter in the hallway after Ben has died. And, you know, he basically says, I get it. I know what you're going through. And the next scene we have where he shows up later on, he's kind of ribbing him like he's best buddies with him. You know, this is after that whole big dramatic, sort of over-the-top basketball sequence, you know, which I still thought was pretty cool. But I just like the idea that here we have, again, a sort of realistic way of interpreting a friendship. People who don't like each other at the start. I've been through this a couple times in my life. and these people end up being your best friend, that kind of thing. So I hope we see more of that in the sequel. And at the risk of actually going all over the place with this discussion review, if you will, one of the things I loved was Stan Lee's cameo. There he is, the librarian with the headphones on, listening to classical music, being completely oblivious to the fact that the whole library is being torn apart by the lizard and Spider-Man behind him. I laughed my ass off when I saw that. And, not everything was pitch perfect for the film. I will say that. There were some little things here and there, like when, Spidey's basically going down to track the lizard in the sewers, and you see all these other little lizards and stuff. Number one, I didn't even know there were geckos and lizards in New York. I mean, I got them all over the place down here in Florida, but I didn't know they were in New York, number one. Number two, seeing them all sort of, travel along the webs underneath, in those tunnels leading toward Connors, and this is what, makes Peter go and investigate, find his little lair underground. That did get a little bit sketchy for me, and as well as, like I say, that whole thing with him sort of talking to himself in a very Green Goblin-esque manner. But otherwise, I just really enjoyed this film. I thought the performances were stellar. The casting was pitch perfect by the end of it. And it really has me set up for the next one. I can't wait to see more of Oscorp. I can't wait to potentially see more of the Osborns. I don't know who the villain's going to be, but as of the time of this recording, there is rumors that Jamie Foxx may be playing the villain Electro, and that could be interesting. I'm hoping for a Mysterio appearance at some point. I thought I read somewhere that somebody was speculating that's who that, character in the shadows when Connors is in prison and telling him to stay away from Parker at the very end, that post-credit sequence. I don't know if that's Mysterio or not, or who that was meant to be, but as far as the next movie goes, I'm just amped. I don't know, are they going to kill off Gwen Stacy? I know there's talk of casting a Mary Jane, and I can't wait to see where this is going to unfold. I love this cast. I love this take on Spider-Man. And one final thing I do want to note is the fact that I went into this hearing this was going to be a darker take on Spider-Man. I didn't know they meant that literally, because most of the action sequences take place at night. They actually literally meant it's darker. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below what you thought of The Amazing Spider-Man. Did you like it as much as I did? Do you still prefer the Raimi films over this? Or are you on board for this new generation of Spidey? And otherwise, that's pretty much all I'm going to say on it. I hope this video made sense. I think I got a little rambly here and there. But otherwise, that's pretty much going to be it for me, so I'll catch you later. Peace.